Hello, everybody, and very welcome to the first of our themed webinars about language education and multilingualism. My name is Christina Cunningham. I'm working at the European Commission at the Directorate General for Education and Culture. And my special field is language education and multilingualism. First of all, I would like to thank NESET for hosting this webinar and the three next ones in the 3 coming weeks. NESET stands for Network of Experts in the Social Aspects of Education and Training, if I'm not mistaken. It is a network that was set up by the European Commission some 6-7 years ago in order to advise the European Commission on strategies in the field of education. They are coordinated by a company called PPMI. Don't ask me what that acronym stands for, please, but it is based in Lithuania. So the headquarters are in Lithuania, but they have colleagues, collaborators all across Europe and beyond. Both NESET, myself, and the panelists, who you can see, are extremely excited to share the next hour together with all of you. It is actually amazing because we haven't really advertised these webinars for very long, but the response has been absolutely amazing and beyond every expectation. You are actually more than 500 people to register for today. This actually shows how important and how relevant the issues are that we are going to discuss, and how many people care deeply about language education and multilingualism. This is actually not difficult to understand if you think about it. What is the key to equity and social inclusion? What gives you the access to labor markets and opens the world? And what is also the key to generally a rich and fulfilled life? I'll tell you, it's education. And what is it that will help us face the big challenges of our time? If it's climate change, pandemics, and social unrest, it's education. And guess what? Education begins with languages. The best thing about my job in Brussels is that I get to meet and collaborate with some of the most prominent researchers in the field of language education and education about languages. And the other thing is that we also get to bring these people together in order to help and advise the European Commission and our member states how to adopt their education systems to changing parameters. And you know, when great minds come together and great minds think alike, amazing things can happen. So with that, I would like to introduce to you our speakers today. First, the team from Toronto. Up on top left of my screen, I don't know about yours, is Professor Jim Cummins. Jim is a little bit of a legend, if I may say so, Jim. Professor Emeritus, which I find amazing considering that you're only 45 years old, at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. You also took your experience from a bilingual country over the pond to Finland, didn't you? You spent 3 years at the University of Åbo, the Åbo Academy University in Finland. Åbo is Turku in Finland, and I believe the Åbo University is a Swedish-speaking university, correct?
The branch that's in Wasser is.
Jim also has more honorary doctorates than I have time to go into here, but it's all in the NESET report, so you can look it up. Jim's research, I'm sure many of you know, focuses on literacy development in educational context characterized by linguistic diversity, which is actually most educational contexts all over the world today. The other member of our Toronto team is Emmanuelle Pichon. Emmanuelle was previously in Utrecht, but is now, I think it was Jim who might have had something to do with that, because she, no, nothing at all. She abandoned the Netherlands and is now assistant professor at the same university where Jim is professor emeritus, the University of Toronto, Ontario, at the Institute for Studies in Education. There, Emmanuelle is also head of the Centre de Recherche en Éducation Franco-Ontarienne. Further to that, she is the co-founder of the Language Friendly School Network, or label, I'm not sure what to call it, together with another amazing personality, Ellen Rose Campbell, who we will have the pleasure of meeting in our webinar next week. And of course, Emmanuelle is also a co-author of the chapter that we are discussing today in the NESET report, together with Hanna Siarova and Esther Zoni. Nathalie, can you hear us now? That is nice. We can't hear you at the moment, but I suppose you muted your microphone. Nathalie is a professor at the University of Montpellier in France, where she is specializing in socio-linguistic aspects of literacy development, among other things. I've had the pleasure of working or getting acquainted with Nathalie's work since many years. And it is quite amazing what she has been doing in projects, for instance, targeting the Roma population or other people who came to France with other languages than French. And you will be able to, you can't look up Nathalie in the NESET report, but there are plenty of interesting videos featuring Nathalie Auger on YouTube. And I'm going to put one of them in the chat box later on today. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Household rules. We have a large audience. We will not be able to give you the floor. You cannot speak, but we invite you warmly to communicate in the chat box. While you listen to the panelists, please put your questions in the chat. We will not be able to answer all questions because there are hundreds of you, but we will try to cluster them and to answer as many as we can. We will also have the opportunity, I'm trying to speak slowly, to come back to some of the questions that we don't have time to reply to today in our fourth seminar in the beginning of July, because there we will do a little bit of a summary of everything that we have learned so far. And if you still want to get in touch, you have the option to give your email address to NESET, and they will be able to contact you after the seminar and link any questions that you may have to any of the panelists. I also am happy to tell you that this webinar is being recorded and that it will be available on NESET's YouTube channel for everybody who doesn't have time to be with us today or who want to return to this later. Have I forgotten something? I hope not. In that case, it is my immense pleasure to give the floor to Jim and Emmanuelle, who will make a joint presentation to us about how to help multilingual children to catch up and succeed through interactive online tools. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm very honored to be here today, and thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you for organizing this webinar. I'm also very honored to be able to present with Jim, Professor Jim Cummins, on how to help multilingual children to succeed with the use of online learning tool. My name is Emmanuelle Pichon, and I won't redo the presentation that you did so well, Christina. Thank you so much. Jim?
Just, I'd like to welcome everybody personally to the webinar, and I'm here as second fiddle to Emmanuelle. So Emmanuelle will start off, and I'll jump in a little while.
Thank you. Okay, first problem. Let me stop share, reshare, and show. This happens often, so no, sorry, stop share, share screen, and reshare. Yes. So today's presentation will start with what we call new challenges in our schools. Why do we talk about new challenges? Not only mobility, but also, of course, the pandemic we have just gone through, and some countries are still coping with. Then we'll see what are the lessons that we already learned from research. So, of course, there is research going on at the moment, like always, but what is it that we know already that could help us to support these learners? And then we'll share with you some observations we did on a pilot we did last year on a web-based program called Studi Binogi, and on which we are still doing research. And then hopefully have a discussion all together, and we'll be able to answer your questions. I hope I'm not speaking too fast. I also have a strong French accent. Apologies for that. And please don't hesitate to let know to the panelists whether I should talk slower. So I think it's important to recall these facts. We all know that the mobility of individuals in the world has increased at an astonishing rate. And in fact, it's according to the United Nations, it's almost doubled since 10 years. And this increase of mobility obviously has consequences for society and for our schools, for our school systems. First of all, it has blurred our previously existing linguistic and cultural borders. And that is extremely important. What happens, what do we see in research? We see that sadly, language learners that we also call minority language students are overrepresented in groups that fall behind in literacy skills, including numeracy. And studies are showing that over and over. So what does it mean, increased mobility? We tend to think of mobility as a one-step process from one country to the other. But in fact, it is rarely what happens. What happens is that people move from one country to the other. And moving from one country to the other, the students move from one system to the other, from one school to the other, from one curriculum to the other, from one language to the other. So you see, there is not only a language implication, but there is also content learning implication, program, schools, norms, habits, etc. Those are all transitions that schools need to support. So what happens with these children, with these students? Well, sadly enough, very often they are like we call submersive, schooled in submersive schooling. What does it mean? It's not a program at all. It means the schooling of language learners in systems that do not include their own languages, that do not take into account what they already know and bring with them. So, lesson learned from research. It's important to realize that catching up, we talked about catching up in the summary. Catching up means closing the gaps in terms of languages and of cultural knowledge, of course, but also gaps in terms of curriculum content. So the challenges for the learners are, in fact, this simultaneous acquisition of academic content and school language and literacy. How do you want to understand the academic content if you are not able to understand the school language, if you cannot read in that language? Well, teachers may also have challenges. In fact, they may lack specific content instructional strategies in order to address their students' needs. So you see, the mobility of the students' population has changed the rules. Students and teachers come with a diversity of strengths and needs that we were already trying to address before the pandemic, but that are now emphasized by the disrupted spring that we just had. Jim.
Okay, thanks, Emmanuelle. When we look at the need to provide support for an extended period of time to students who are coming from immigrant backgrounds, there are two bits of research that are, I think, directly related to what we're talking about and to what we'll talk about in terms of the potential of online support to help teachers to meet students' needs. One of these research findings, or sets of research findings, relates to how long it takes students from immigrant backgrounds to catch up academically with students who are native speakers of the host country language. There's research that I was able to carry out about 40 years ago involving a reanalysis of data from the Toronto Board of Education. And what came out of that was that we're looking at a much longer period of time for students to catch up academically than it takes students to catch up with respect to ordinary, everyday conversational fluency. Emmanuelle, if you can change the slide. Thank you. This is one of the graphs from that study, and it illustrates, I think, exactly what the challenges for immigrant background students are, as well as the challenges for teachers in supporting them in catching up. On the graph, you see LOR stands for length of residence. And so we have several different lengths of residence involved in this sample. This was a sample of about 1,200 students that was part of a larger sample of about over 5,000 students from grades 5, 7, and 9 in the Toronto Board. The sample that you're seeing here were students who came from immigrant backgrounds who were born outside of Canada and who are learning English as an additional language. AOA down at the bottom stands for age on arrival. And then the vertical axis are standard deviation units. So -1 there would be the equivalent of 15 standard score points. So if you have a mean of 100, -1 would be the equivalent of 85. So what you see in this graph is that students who have been in Canada for about 1 year are about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, or 22, 23 standard score points. After 3 years, they've come up to at -1 standard deviations, about 15 points. But it takes between 5 and 7 years for students to come close to grade norms in terms of catching up academically to the average of their grade levels. Now, this pattern of findings has been replicated in numerous studies in the UK, in Israel, several in the United States, and also in Canada. And these are ballpark figures. So they're not figures that are set in stone. There will be variation here. But if we look at what's, if we look at the reasons why it takes longer for students to catch up academically, as opposed to catching up in conversational fluency, there are two reasons. One, academic language is complex. If you think about the language of textbooks at grade 7, 8, 9, we're looking at a kind of language that students do not use in everyday context outside of the school. And secondly, immigrant background students are catching up to a moving target, because every year students from students who are native speakers of the school language are making progress in terms of their reading skills, their writing skills, their vocabulary knowledge. And so students from immigrant backgrounds have to run faster to catch up academically. Now, in many countries, students who are learning the school language, they get 1 year, maybe a year and a half of specialized language support to help them learn the school language. But we're looking at a much longer period of time than 1.5 years for students to catch up. So what this means is that the mainstream classroom teacher has got to know how to be able to provide support for students as they're acquiring content and language together. And in most countries, certainly in Europe and North America, countries that I'm most familiar with, the mainstream classroom teachers have typically not had the opportunity to acquire this knowledge of how to support students in learning the language at the same time as they're learning content. So that's one part of the research. A second set of findings relates to the role of students' home languages in acquiring academic knowledge in the second language. And there's an increasing amount of research showing strong relationships between how well students' home language gets developed and how quickly and how successfully they can acquire academic skills in the second language. So the term that is often used to talk about this is that first and second language academic proficiencies are interdependent or positively related to each other. If we can move on to the next slide, Emmanuelle. I've used this visual metaphor to talk about what the research is saying. And so what this is, if you think about an iceberg, we all know that what you see above the surface is much less in terms of total volume or mass than what's below the surface. And so we can think, if we think of language proficiency as an iceberg, where the obvious aspects of language that we hear and perhaps see as we interact with somebody, how quickly they speak, what kind of accent they've got, all of those obvious aspects of the language can be seen as surface features of the language, how fluent they may be in the language. But what's much more relevant in terms of academic success is what's below the surface, the extent to which students can use language and features of language effectively in the context of learning in school. And so range of vocabulary will be one aspect of this, reading knowledge, ability to write, all of those kinds of things can be seen as below the surface. And what this visual metaphor is saying is that even though the surface aspects of different languages are different and separate from each other, there's a lot of overlap, a lot of interdependence, commonality at a deeper level between the languages. So this common underlying proficiency helps explain why students who come in, say at grade 5, grade 6, and who have had education in their home language, they know what the concept of photosynthesis is getting at in their home language. They don't have to relearn that concept all over again in the new language. They have to learn how to talk about that concept in the new language, but the concept itself is already there. So the common underlying proficiency represents a fusion of cognitive, academic, and linguistic knowledge. If you think about a concept like democracy, it's hard to pull apart like what's academic, what's linguistic, what's cognitive. And so what we're talking about in this common underlying proficiency is the sort of knowledge that students need to be able to acquire within school contexts. And so what Binogi tries to do is enable students to gain access to this knowledge, both in their first language and in the second language, so that the two languages can support each other. So it's one way of teaching for transfer across languages. So back to you, Emmanuelle.
Thank you. So if I may summarize, Jim, what are lessons that we learned from research in order to help children to catch up or students to catch up with school content? One thing is sure, we need to involve the home languages in education. This also means that we need to use the linguistic repertoire strategically in order to help our students to communicate their thinking, to enrich meaning making in classroom, to support an accelerated learning. And very often we forget to talk about that, the cognitive gains supporting accelerated learning. So educators should adopt what we call a translanguaging approach. And I think that we will have more time to talk about that later. So the languages of students are resources that we need to build upon in order to help accelerate the learning. But I would say the second lesson is that supporting the home languages of students in education also means enrolling their families. And there are, again, various studies in different domains that have shown that the benefits are incredible of a strong engagement of parents and communities in education. But the question is really how. I have a class with 30 students, 25 different languages. How do I involve home languages in education? How do I enroll the families? Please give me the key. So there are many strategies, pedagogical strategies developed at the moment. And Binogi, Study Binogi, the web-based program we would like to present, is in fact one of them. It is composed of a series of lessons based on the local curriculum, and I would define it as a co-teaching method that teachers can use for students. It's not replacing the teacher. It's in fact, the teachers still create their lessons to be delivered digitally or in person, whatever, but they can use Binogi, they can use Study Binogi to reinforce the learning of the content. So like Jim was saying, the particularity of this platform is that students may switch back and forth between languages. So in Canada, for instance, they may switch between the two official languages, French and English, also school languages, but also to their own languages like Arabic, Somali, Tigrinya, Dari. They can do that when listening to the videos or when putting the subtitles, reading the texts. So this is how it shows, and you will see it if you read the report. There is a lesson comparing fractions with different denominators, and then they choose the spoken language and the subtitles, and they can re-listen, they can, etc. So now we'd like to very quickly introduce you to what the students said about Binogi during our pilot. First, there were grade 6 students, so 11 years old. And what they liked first was the gamification of knowledge. They said it's less boring. Studying is less boring. You can see it here. I don't know if you see my... And math is fun with Binogi. The third one says, and that is very interesting, you can play it at home. So what it is doing, web-based program, in fact, bridging the home educational environment to the school educational environment. They also liked the flexible cross-linguistic transfer that was made possible. It helps me in my language. I like that you can change the language. But more surprisingly, they also like the cross-modal transfer. One said, we can read instead of watch the video. We always infer that they want to watch instead of reading, but some want to read. So in fact, what it is doing is giving back the learning agency to the students. The third, luckily enough, they reported academic gains. So not only geometry, addition, division, like this one is saying, but also more metacognitive skills, like it makes me study more. So this awareness of how I should learn and how much I should invest in order to learn. And the fourth one that was for us very surprising, because it's sometimes so hard to convince people to use the home languages, but the students were very aware of it. They let you choose which language you want to learn with. Why not? We all choose the languages we want to learn with. So many people can learn math with whatever language they are comfortable with. So they were very aware of, in fact, the fact that the education system is reduced to the languages taught within the curriculum. But in fact, that these kind of platforms opens it up to all other languages and re-establish a kind of more social justice. What did the teachers say about it? I don't know if we still have time. Christina, do we? Okay. They reported, that was very interesting, that they were more able to disentangle a lack of school language from a lack of math understanding. So this teacher said, in fact, when I repeated in Arabic the questions, the children were perfectly able to solve the problem, but they, even though they were fluent in English, they were not able to understand the question in English. They reported less anxiety, more confidence, excitement. Look at what this teacher says, very impressive. When I saw them being taught in that language and they were able to connect to it, that's what impressed me. And I've seen that so often, children, the content being taught in their own language, that they all of a sudden could understand what was being taught. So very quickly, our conclusions. In fact, it's not new. 40 years of research have shown that education in languages that students understand well in combination to the language, to the school language, produces the best results. What we saw with this pilot with Binogi study is that it is entertaining, it is instructive, it facilitates content-related gains, and also the development of metacognitive strategies. There is a social justice aspect related to its provision of multilingual access to content, and we talk a lot about that into the report. That when supported, and I insist on that, when supported and encouraged by scaffolding strategies, for instance, or other instructional strategies by teaching staff, it may increase the students' self-confidence over the year. And interviews with teachers also suggested that it might play a useful role in helping them integrate language and content for students learning the school language. So in fact, we may summarize it as such, I think. Multilingual online systems may support students in gaining access and learning curriculum content in a way that enables the biographical continuity in bridging home and school language, school educational environments, a thematic continuity by offering language-sensitive content across and within disciplines, but also a plurilingual continuity. This aspect we insist a lot about in the report, to ensure that all students, and here I really insist, all students may be able to maintain, but even consolidate and increase their plurilingual skills, their linguistic repertoire. So thank you very much. And we wanted to introduce the discussion part with some things that you may want to think about. First one being, what would be your strategies to include home languages in your teaching, or what are your strategies? You may already be doing that. What are or would be your strategies to include parents and relatives in your teaching? And if you have used online teaching, what are your experiences so far? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Emmanuelle and Jim, for this comprehensive overview of your research on the system. We have many questions, obviously, and we will also go in a little bit more about what it is, this particular multilingual online tool. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Nathalie, who has indeed taught and also done research in many different contexts where there are multilingual learners who are to some extent struggling to catch up and to develop. Please, Nathalie, what are your reflections and thoughts also on the questions raised by Emmanuelle?
Thank you very much, Christina. First of all, I would like to thank very warmly Emmanuelle and Jim for their wonderful presentation. And this Binogi tool is so relevant in the pandemic context we all are in the moment. So I think it is the time to speak about it and to discuss about the opportunities it can offer to everyone. So before the audience asks questions, I would like to try and answer one of your own questions, Emmanuelle and Jim, that you asked in the end of your PowerPoint. And the question I've chosen is what are or would be your strategy to include home languages in your teaching? And this question is very dear to me because I think that it shouldn't be a strategy. In fact, it should be natural in the classroom. It should be normal practices. But of course, we know that for some teachers and in different schools, it's difficult to include home languages because it is a way to accept, to leave the expertise to the kids. And it's not easy when you are when you are the teacher who should have the knowledge in your class. So I think this is a kind of reflection we have to have when we train teachers, when we think about disseminating Binogi. And my first answer would be to try and reflect on the fact that the teacher is not the only one that is the expert in the classroom. What I would like to say about Binogi is that it can support, of course, newly arrived students in sciences classes, and we can use the expertise of the kids in their home language to develop competencies in STEM, develop competencies in languages. And what you showed is that your results are very consistent. When Jim said that immigrant background students typically require at least 5 years to catch up academically to native speakers, I think Binogi is a very nice tool to develop at the same time content and language all year round in the classroom. Because what we see in research is that most of the time, newly arrived children are focused on the development of French as a second language or English as a second language, but you know, we focus on the language instead of focusing on the contents. And I think it's very important to link the languages and the content all together, because it is the better way to make these kids succeed at school. So I think for this, Binogi is very, very powerful. One reproach we sometimes have as a researcher when we deal with newly arrived students in the schools is that we dedicate tools for newly arrived children, but what about other kids in the classroom? And what is very powerful to me with Binogi is that Binogi is not only for newly arrived kids, it is also very powerful for any students dealing with learning a foreign language at school, for instance, Spanish, English, and so on. Because when the kids select the videos and the quiz, it can be an additional language he try and learn at school. So Binogi, of course, is a very powerful tool for refugees, for asylum seekers, but I think it's very powerful for everyone in the class. You know, it's a tool for the elite seeking to learn additional languages, and at the same time for vulnerable people. So I think it's very important to link all together, and to see that Binogi is very interesting for everyone. As you said very briefly, Emmanuelle, Binogi is also a very nice tool to include the parents, even if they do not know how to write and read, because the parents can watch the videos at home with their kids. They can discuss about the videos with their children, and it's very nice to make the parents be part of the educational community thanks to Binogi. And of course, they can follow what their kids do in the science classes, and they can also speak about the languages they use in their daily life. I think it's a good way to deal with the fact we have many languages in our context, and that you can speak about this situation with the kids. Your project reminds me of another one called Planting Languages, that is funded by the European Commission, which deals with home language and the way it can help parents to have a clear discussion about the way they use languages at home, at school, with the teachers, with their kids, and so on. And I think Binogi can be a very good opportunity for parents and kids to be clear about the languages they use, sometimes the feeling they have when they use one language or another language. So I think it can be a good opportunity to discuss this topic. What I would like also to add is that, and I saw one of the questions in the chat, that Binogi can help regarding literacy, because you have videos, you have a multi-sensitive program with Binogi regarding audio, written text, videos, and so on. So of course, when you enter literacy, thanks to the videos, to the subtitles, it can help very much the students. And you know, most of the times we say that for kids from 11 to 14, it's difficult to find artifacts to help them how to write and read. And I think Binogi is a good opportunity, thanks to the videos, thanks to the subtitles, thanks to the fact you can change your language. And it's very interesting that it could be used also as a tool for literacy. So maybe it could be explored in the future. I think it could be a nice thing to do. To me, Binogi, of course, helps the kids, but also the families, as I said, and of course the teachers. So I think it's very important, because most of the time, some teachers do not know what to do with newly arrived kids. And it's very interesting because thanks to Binogi, the tool can be used, you know, anytime in science classes, and it can be very interesting to teachers to be trained to use Binogi. It's very easy. Maybe you will have some questions about it. I think I saw some of them in the chat. And it's very easy because you can show the video in the classrooms. You can ask the kids to watch the video before the class. You can include the parents. You can work on the text, on the subtitles. And of course, you have quizzes. So, well, you have many opportunities to work with Binogi. What I would like to say now, and maybe it will be my last comment, is that when you say, Emmanuelle and Jim, that Binogi is a multilingual program, to me, it is, first of all, a STEM program. And it's the best way to learn STEM. Why? Because it is an active way of empowering children. It is a multi-sensitive tool. You have videos, images, audio, written text, and it can be used in so many ways with the students, the families, and at school, and not only with STEM teachers, but also with language teachers and the teachers of the language of schooling. So to me, of course, First of all, it was designed, Binogi was designed for newly arrived children, but I think, to me, it should be a STEM program for itself. So maybe we can think about it to disseminate it more and more around the schools. And my last comment is about the fact that, of course, we are in a complex situation with newly arrived children, with the pandemic situation we are in, the pedagogic continuity we have to develop in our situation. But I think Binogi is here to help in these different ways. And I remember one of your kids' comments, and one of them said, it's fun. And I think we are in a complex situation, but we have a good tool that is, fun in a way. Because why is it fun? Because it's an opportunity to act with your languages, to be ready to use your different senses to understand the contents. So I think we have to decomplex our reality thanks to tools like Binogi today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. Obviously, we have many questions. Many of them are quite detailed when it comes to the technical side of Binogi and what is possible and what is not and so on. Obviously, we will not have the possibility to go into that now. We will provide you with the link where you can start your own researches and see how it works in your particular context. But we will also try to reply to some very concrete things like ages and so on. Before that, we as panelists are extremely curious as to who is out there in the big void and in cyberspace. And before we continue with your questions, we would very much like to know just a little bit who you are. And in order to do that, we are going to make a very quick little survey, extremely quick, with the Mentimeter instrument, which you will now, if everything goes well, see on the screen. NESET will post the link to Menti. So you need to go on your own browser to www.menti.com. You can see the link on top of the screen now, and use the code 969372. You can see it on top of your screen if everything is okay. And you can see the question, which sector do you represent? You are all very quick and very resourceful. You are there now and you can see the replies coming in. We have 22, 36 people, 41. We'll keep going, half a minute or so. So you go on your browser, you tap www.menti.com. The Menti will then open the website, and then you have to give the code, which you see on your screen, 969372. Then you can see the question. It's only to still our curiosity. So thank you very much for that. 126 people have already answered our first question. We will end the survey in a few seconds. 156, because we have one more question. 168. 78, 73, 76. Now you've all got the hang of this. Thank you. So we'll stop here. Cosmin, please. And we will go on to the second question, which is about where are you? Well, this says which country are you from? But I would like to amend that a little bit. In which country are you right now? In which country are you right now? Because it's not necessarily the country that you are from. As for me, for instance, I'm from Sweden, but I am in Belgium. So in which country are you right now? So this is really interesting. We have many, many European countries represented. We have a majority Ireland at the moment, Netherlands. Then we have Turkey. We have India. We have Canada, obviously. Do we have the US of A? Can't see the US of A at the moment. Senegal. That's amazing. I would need my glasses. Okay, 223 people. Indonesia. Mexico. This is so cool. I don't know how many time zones we have represented here. Trinidad and Tobago, obviously, but not the United States of America. Okay, thank you all so much. That's really, really interesting. We have a few minutes left. Thank you very much. And it's an almost impossible task to try to choose some areas to discuss with the few minutes that we have left. As I said, we don't go into the technicalities of the Binogi tool, but because you will be able to find out that for yourself. Perhaps only one relatively technical question to Jim and Emmanuelle. Is there an ideal age for using Binogi? Is there an ideal age for using Binogi? You have to unmute yourself, Jim. Jim, unmute.
I think most of the lessons to this point are roughly between age 11 up to lower, maybe age 14, 15. So the lower parts of secondary, or the higher ends of secondary school. But that's going to vary from one country to another, depending on what's in the curriculum at different stages. Christina, you need to...
now you are muted.
Yeah, we'll get the hang of this. Another thing about the tool specifically is some people wonder how students' ICT proficiency influence their progress.
Emmanuelle, go ahead.
Oh, that's a difficult question. Thank you. This is something that we discovered through the pandemic, that in fact, students and teachers were not prepared to massive teaching and learning online. But what is very interesting is that when implementing the program, we discovered in fact that when it was not the children who had the most difficulty to enter the platform and work with it. Actually, they learned pretty quickly. And they are very fast at learning how to manage it and find new tools, etc. But more teachers needed really to integrate it strategically to their own lessons plan and think about how am I going to use it? What are, as I said, it's not a platform that replaces the teacher. It's a platform that complements the teachers. It's a co-teaching tool. I guess you agree, Jim?
Absolutely. It can be used in multiple ways. And going back to one of the points that I think both Christine and Nathalie referred to, it can be used not just for students who are learning the school language, but it's also used very effectively, for example, in Sweden, where it's been used extensively with students whose native language is the school language. So it's useful as a quick way of giving the essence of a lesson. It's useful for students to talk about with their parents at home, if they choose, because they can access it at home. And so it has multiple uses that can be implemented in very flexible ways.
Yeah. That brings me to another, let's say, cluster of questions, which is a little bit not the application in itself, but what it stands for. The idea of breaking down the barriers. I think it was Nathalie who said, this is great for STEM. Yeah. And what you do when you use this methodology, and it doesn't, I understand it doesn't necessarily have to be Studi by Nogi, but what you have explained to us is a different mindset, a mindset where you break down barriers between the different languages and between the different subjects and between school and home, between teachers and students and parents. That's what I take away from what you have been saying. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think it's extremely interesting. For the teachers, like Nathalie said, they really need to get out of their comfort zone and give the expertise to the children, back to the students, back to the children. And of course, they need to develop a pedagogy around it, what we call translanguaging pedagogy. And this is, it has to be, they need to invest into that. I wanted to react to some people who said, but how many languages are represented in the platform? And obviously not all languages are represented in the platform. And what happened last year was extremely interesting. At a certain point, I was in the classroom and children said, but my language is not there. I cannot see my language. And if you read the report, you will see a picture, because I said to the children, okay, your language is not there, but maybe you can put your language in there. You can do something about that. So what about translating in your own language and coming back to it? And I come back next week and we are going to add it to the posters. And I just said that, I was there in the class for 5 minutes and I came back the week after. And 4 students were so proud of showing me that they had written translated the terms in their own language. It was, very, very nicely formatted, and I could put it on the wall under the posters, and we took pictures and we celebrated. So, of course, not all the languages are represented in the platform, but it is really a way of introducing a kind of legitimacy of all languages. All languages are resources.
That also connects very well with other questions that we have received about, people teaching in international context. They have so many languages present in the classroom. Some have, 25 languages in a classroom. And somebody said, personally, I prefer to stick to English. And I'm glad that that question came up. But I think that you answered that already partly with what you said. It's not about teaching in other languages if the language of schooling is English. It's about the legitimacy of all other languages, and it's about using all other languages as a scaffolding on which you build up the other competencies step by step. Is that correct?
Of course, ideally, you would like to speak all of these languages. And I must say that last year I had a teacher and she was an Arabic speaker too. And it was an incredible help to, understand what the children understood or not, etc. So to be in the classroom. So that's the ideal situation, but it's often not the case. So I totally agree with what you say, Christina. When it's not the case, then we have to rely on the families, we have to rely on the parents, on the communities, on friends within the classroom by clustering the children together in order to help them to understand the content better, to help them to discuss the content, etc. Maybe Jim, you want to add something?
Yeah, just some background to Studi Binogi. Term used in Sweden is Studi, and the program was developed in Sweden, and the choice of languages to include in addition to Swedish was dictated to a considerable extent by the languages of immigrant students that were coming in major numbers to Sweden in 2014, 2015. And so you have languages that are not languages of wider communication, but languages that were very salient in the schooling of students in Sweden during that period of time. In principle, any language can be incorporated into the program, but that involves development, it involves money, it involves time. And but understanding where the languages came from, I think gives a sense of what the priorities of the developers were, rather than going for high utility languages that would have immediate impact and sales. They went for languages that were in need in the schools in Sweden during the period when the program was being developed.
Okay, thank you. I see one more thing. We are slightly over time, but I think we'll go on another 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. As we said in the beginning, please hold on to your questions. We will have the opportunity to come back to some of them in future webinars, and we can also contact you directly, bilaterally. I am going to look for a question that just disappeared from my chat. I do apologize. I would like to find it again. Oh yes. Yeah, I would like to actually end with that question because it is also extremely relevant right now during the pandemic, when so much teaching and learning has to take place remotely. What about the families that have no access to laptops or other ICT resources? What are the resources that can be used that are not perhaps electronic, but building on the same idea to use language of schooling and home language to reinforce each other? What would be your advice to families that are really in a relatively bad place when it comes to electronic devices? Who would like to reply? It's a difficult question.
Maybe I'll just start off, and Emmanuelle can add to it. Most teenagers, certainly, and most families at this point in countries around the world do have access to mobile phones, and Binogi can be accessed through mobile phones. And that's, in fact, one of the ways in which students in the pilot project that Emmanuelle and I and others conducted got access to the program outside of the school context. In the Canadian context right now, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of school systems have essentially donated on loan Chromebooks or other computers so that all students, all families can get access to the internet and follow remote learning. And so I think if there's a tool out there that is seen by school administrators as having strong utility, then the issues of lack of access to electronic learning will gradually be addressed. But obviously the question is a very valid one, and it raises the issue of, what our priorities are in terms of making sure that all students and all families have access to the learning resources that are available.
Yes, I agree. It's a very important question. And of course, again, the question of social justice. It is true that many families, many refugee families have access to the internet, have access to phones. So Binogi is covering that. But what I would like to add is that very often, what is lacking is not per se the technical tool, but the communication around it. So if all explanations are in the school language, how do you want parents and families to understand what the child is going to do with it and how to manage it? See the difficulty we have to get used to Zoom and the functions and to look around it, and we all understand English here. So very often there is a lack of we have to adjust again to communicating with families, parents, and going to them and explaining to them how it works, etc. So there, of course, the pandemic was, came so suddenly and we were all surprised by it. But how come that we did not develop it better in the past 10 years? I mean, how come that we were surprised? That is the most surprising.
Christina, don't forget to unmute.
Yeah. Sorry, Nathalie, any last word? Any last reflection from your side? Madame Auger?
Well, I would like to say that Binogi is online, so I think everyone should test it, should look at it and try it. And maybe it could be a good source of inspiration for the teachers everywhere in the world.
Thank you. Right. Unfortunately, we will have to wrap up this webinar now. All that remains for me is to thank all three panelists from all my heart for having shared all this with us, and also Cosmin and the NESET staff. You have done a fantastic job. I would like to announce the next webinar in the series. From the content, it will be very different actually, because it will focus more on learning, so to say, foreign languages, or increasing the language learning capacities. But it will also present the concept of the language-friendly schools that we mentioned in the beginning of today, which was launched by Emmanuelle and Ellen Rose, also as another network of schools working together. So here you see the teaser for the next webinar, and I can only encourage all of you to register and to come back next week, same time, same place. And we would love to see you again and to continue this interesting discussion. So, okay, until then, thank you very much again, everybody. Take care, stay safe, and see you next week.